Jonah Merritt had exactly $14 in his coat pocket when the woman in the gold coat flagged down his cab on the worst night of the year to be driving in Minneapolis. She was sobbing so hard she could barely give him an address. And the moment he pulled away from the curb, something told him this ride was going to cost him more than a fare. He had no idea that by morning, his phone would be ringing off the hook with a message that would turn his entire life upside down. Hey everyone, welcome back to Wintervale. If stories about kindness finding its way home means something to you, tap that subscribe button and stay with this one until the very end, because tonight's story earns every minute of it. I've always believed that snow has a way of making the world quieter and kinder at the same time, like it's asking everyone to slow down for a second. This story came from that feeling, and from wondering what happens when one small act of decency lands in exactly the right pair of hands. I hope it warms you the way it warmed me while I wrote it. The snow had been falling since noon that day, thick and steady, turning the streets of downtown Minneapolis into a slow crawl of taillights and slush. Jonah had been driving for 9 hours straight, and his knees ached from sitting, and his stomach growled from skipping lunch, but he needed one more fare before he could justify calling it a night. His sister Hazel was waiting at home with homework she wouldn't finish without him standing over her shoulder. He saw her outside the Hendricks building on Nicollet Mall, a woman in a cream-colored coat that had clearly cost more than his car, standing in the snow without gloves, without a hat, shaking so hard he thought at first she was simply cold. It was only when she turned toward his headlights that he saw her face was wet and raw from crying, the kind of crying that had been going on for a while before he ever showed up. She climbed into the back seat without really looking at him and gave an address in a neighborhood Jonah only ever saw from the outside. Big houses with long driveways and gates that opened themselves. He asked if she was all right, mostly out of habit, the way any driver asks, but she just shook her head and pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and said nothing for the first several minutes of the ride. Jonah didn't push. He had learned a long time ago that some people needed silence more than they needed conversation. So he just drove, careful on the icy roads, glancing at her in the mirror every so often to make sure she was still breathing evenly. Somewhere around the 5th minute, she started talking without him asking anything at all, the words spilling out like she couldn't hold them in any longer. She told him her name was Margot, and that she had just come from a lawyer's office where she had signed away her rights to contest her late father's estate, at least the part of it that mattered to her, because fighting for it meant fighting her own family in a courtroom, and she couldn't stomach doing that to her father's memory. She said she felt like she had just buried him a second time. Jonah listened, really listened, the way he wished someone had listened to him after his own parents died 5 years earlier in a highway accident just outside Duluth, leaving him to raise a 9-year-old sister on a mechanic's severance check and whatever fares he could scrape together. He remembered those first months clearly, the sleepless nights teaching himself to braid Hazel's hair from videos on his phone, the school counselor's careful questions, the way grief had made him older almost overnight in a way nobody his age was supposed to understand yet. He didn't say any of that to her, not that night, but something about her grief made room for his own in a way strangers usually didn't, a quiet recognition passing between two people who had both learned, in very different houses, exactly how heavy losing a parent could feel. When they reached her address, a mansion with windows lit gold against the falling snow, she reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out enough cash to cover 3 rides, maybe 4. He looked at the money in her hand and then at her face, still blotchy from crying, and something in him just couldn't take it. He told her to keep it, that the ride was on him tonight, that everybody needed one thing to go right on a day like this. She stared at him like he had spoken a language she didn't recognize anymore. Then she thanked him so quietly he almost missed it and disappeared through the gate into the snow. Jonah sat there a moment longer than he needed to, watching the door close behind her, before he finally pulled the car back onto the road and let the silence of the ride settle over him like something almost sacred. He drove home thinking about her the whole way, not because of the house or the money she tried to give him, but because of the particular kind of loneliness in her voice, the kind that money clearly hadn't been able to touch. He picked Hazel up from the neighbor's apartment where she waited after school, made grilled cheese for dinner, and sat with her at the kitchen table while she worked through fractions she didn't understand. "Are you even listening, Jonah?" Hazel asked him for the second time, poking his arm with her pencil, and he laughed and apologized and made himself focus on her worksheet instead of the woman still lingering in his thoughts. He fell asleep on the couch not long after tucking her in, exhausted in the particular way that came from carrying two people's worth of worry on one set of shoulders. His phone rang at 11:40 that night, an unknown number, and he almost let it go to voicemail because nothing good ever called that late except bad news about a fare or a repair bill. He answered anyway, and a man's voice, older, measured, asked if he was speaking with the driver who had brought Margot Sterling home earlier that evening. Jonah's stomach dropped, certain he had done something wrong. The man introduced himself as Walter Combs and said he had worked for the Sterling family for over 30 years, first as a driver and then as something closer to a member of the household. He explained that Margot had come inside shaking, not from the cold, but from what Jonah had done, refusing her money on a night when she felt like the entire world had already taken everything it could from her. Jonah didn't understand why any of that warranted an 11:40 phone call, and said as much, gently, because he still had no idea who the Sterling family actually was. Walter laughed softly and told him that Margot's late father, Harold Sterling, had built one of the largest logistics companies in the Midwest, and that Margot herself had walked away from nearly all of it that afternoon rather than fight her stepbrother in court. Walter asked if Jonah would be willing to come by the house the next morning, not for anything he needed to worry about, just so the family could properly thank him. Jonah hesitated, thinking about the fare he'd lose and the odd gap in his schedule, but something about the old man's voice, warm and a little urgent, made him say yes before he'd fully decided to. He barely slept that night, turning the conversation over in his head, wondering what kind of family sent a butler to track down a cab driver over a $14 fare he'd waived out of instinct. Hazel asked him twice at breakfast why he kept staring at his coffee instead of drinking it, and he told her it was nothing, though even he didn't fully believe that by the time he left for the Sterling estate. The gates opened automatically as his car approached, and Jonah found himself parking behind a row of vehicles worth more than every car he'd ever owned combined, feeling suddenly aware of the oil stain on his jacket sleeve and the crack running across his phone screen. A young receptionist named Yolanda met him just inside the front hall, smiled kindly at his nervous glance around the marble entryway, and told him not to worry, that the Sterlings didn't bite, whatever the rumors said. Walter met him properly a moment later, a tall man in his 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and led him into a sitting room where snow drifted silently past floor to ceiling windows. Margot was already there, and she looked entirely different in daylight, composed, her dark hair pulled back, though her eyes still carried the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She stood when he entered and thanked him again, more steadily this time, telling him that his small refusal had reminded her that kindness without a price tag still existed somewhere in the world, even in a week that had tried its hardest to convince her otherwise. Jonah shifted uncomfortably under the attention, insisting it had been nothing, just a ride like any other, but Margot shook her head and told him it had mattered more than he could possibly understand. She explained, in careful pieces, that her father had died 3 months earlier, and that his will contained an unusual clause requiring her to spend real time reconnecting with the company and the community before she could claim her full inheritance, a clause her stepbrother had fought from the very beginning. Her stepbrother, she said, was named Desmond Rourke, her father's stepson from his second marriage. Desmond had spent the last decade positioning himself as chief operating officer and heir apparent while Margot studied art history overseas and stayed as far from the family business as she could manage. When Harold Sterling died, Desmond had expected the company to fall into his hands cleanly, and instead found himself sharing control with a stepsister he'd never respected and hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. Jonah asked, carefully, why any of that meant she needed to be thanking a stranger who drove a 14-year-old sedan for a living. And Margot smiled for the first time since he'd met her, a small tired smile, and said that sometimes the people with the least reason to be kind were the ones who reminded you kindness still had a reason to exist. She asked if he would stay for coffee, and he found himself saying yes again. That single cup of coffee turned into 2 hours of conversation, easier than Jonah expected, about her father, about Hazel, about the strange loneliness of being surrounded by wealth and still feeling invisible inside it. Walter hovered nearby, refilling cups and pretending not to listen, though the small smile on his face gave him away every time Margot laughed at something Jonah said, a sound Walter admitted later he hadn't heard from her since before the funeral. Before Jonah left that afternoon, Margot asked if she could see him again, not as a driver, just as himself, and he agreed, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest as he drove back through streets still dusted white from the night before. He told himself it was nothing, that a woman like Margot Sterling had no business being interested in a man who counted quarters for laundry, but the thought of her stayed with him the whole way home. Over the following weeks, Jonah and Margot fell into an easy rhythm neither of them had expected: coffee after his morning shifts, quiet walks through Loring Park while snow gathered on the bare branches overhead, long phone calls after Hazel went to bed. Margot began showing up at the community center where Hazel took her Saturday art classes, sitting unnoticed in the back, and Hazel adored her almost immediately, calling her the Snow Lady because she always arrived bundled in white wool. One Saturday, Hazel proudly showed Margot a lopsided watercolor of a cardinal on a snowy branch, and Margot studied it so seriously, asking real questions about the color choices, that Hazel beamed for the rest of the afternoon and later told Jonah she hoped the Snow Lady would come to every single class from then on. Jonah watched the two of them together and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, something dangerously close to hope. One evening in late November, Jonah took Margot to the diner 2 blocks from his apartment instead of anywhere fancier, insisting she try the pie his mother used to order every Sunday before the accident. And Margot ate 2 slices and admitted it was better than anything served at the last 3 galas she'd attended combined. They walked afterward along the frozen edge of the Mississippi, breath fogging in the cold, and Margot asked him gently about his parents. And for the first time since the funeral, he actually let himself talk about the crash on the icy overpass outside Duluth, about identifying his father's watch before anyone let him see the rest. Margot didn't try to fix anything he said, didn't offer platitudes about everything happening for a reason. She just walked beside him in the snow and let the silence hold the weight of it with him, which was somehow exactly what he needed. He told her later that night, half joking, that she was the first person in 5 years who hadn't looked at him like a problem to be solved, and she told him, not joking at all, that he was the first person in longer than that who hadn't looked at her like a bank account to be managed. Down at Sterling Logistics headquarters, Desmond Rourke noticed the change in Margot before anyone else did. The way she started asking real questions in board meetings instead of sitting silently through them. The way she pushed back when he tried to slip contracts past her without a signature. In one meeting, when she asked pointed questions about a shipping vendor she didn't recognize, Desmond waved her off with a tight smile and said perhaps she should focus on settling in before tackling the complicated numbers. Margot didn't back down that day, insisting the vendor contract be reviewed line by line before the board voted, and though Desmond eventually agreed with visible irritation, he lingered afterward in the hallway long enough to ask her, in a voice too casual to be innocent, whether someone had been coaching her on what questions to ask. She told him plainly that curiosity didn't require coaching, and walked away before he could answer. Desmond didn't know who or what had put steel back into her spine, but he intended to find out, and he didn't like what his private investigator eventually brought back to his desk. The report on Jonah Merritt was thin, almost insultingly ordinary. A mechanic's son turned rideshare driver raising a little sister on his own. No criminal record, no debt beyond a modest car loan, nothing that screamed opportunist. Desmond read it twice, unsatisfied, because a man with nothing to gain didn't fit the story he needed to tell, so he decided he would simply have to build one. He requested a meeting with Margot under the pretense of discussing quarterly logistics numbers, and halfway through, casually mentioned that he'd heard she was spending considerable time with her driver, phrasing it in a way that made the words sound cheap even though nothing about her time with Jonah had been. Margot's jaw tightened, and she told him plainly that her personal life was not company business, and Desmond simply smiled and said he hoped that remained true, that the board tended to worry when a controlling shareholder's judgment seemed, in his words, emotionally compromised. She left the meeting rattled in a way she hated admitting even to herself, and drove straight to Jonah's apartment instead of going home. That night, Margot told Jonah about the conversation over dinner at her kitchen table, worry creasing her forehead in a way he hadn't seen since the night he first met her crying in the snow. He reached across the table and told her that whatever Desmond wanted to say about him, he could take it, that he'd survived worse than a rich man's dirty looks. And for a moment, she seemed to believe him completely. Desmond, however, did not simply look dirty at people, he built cases against them. And within 2 weeks he had assembled a narrative he found far more useful than the truth. He met privately with a junior reporter at a struggling business blog, feeding him carefully worded background about a rideshare driver with a pattern of, in Desmond's phrasing, cozying up to vulnerable and wealthy women, and offered, off the record, to connect him with a supposed former passenger willing to talk. The passenger Desmond produced didn't exist, not really, just a name he'd paid a temp agency worker to attach to a quote his own assistant had drafted, claiming Jonah had once asked her for money after a ride and made her deeply uncomfortable. The reporter, hungry for a story with real clicks behind it, ran the piece without verifying much of anything, and by morning it had already been picked up by a larger regional outlet. The story spread faster than either of them expected, painting Jonah as a calculated opportunist who had targeted a grieving heiress in her most vulnerable moment. His rideshare account was flagged within hours, riders canceling trips the moment they recognized his name, and by the end of the week his weekly earnings had dropped to almost nothing, threatening the rent on the small apartment he shared with Hazel. Jonah sat at his kitchen table that night staring at his phone, reading comment after comment calling him a con man, a gold digger, a predator, words that had nothing to do with the man who had simply refused $14 because a stranger looked like she needed one good thing to happen to her. He set the phone face down on the table and pressed both hands over his eyes, trying to breathe through the tightness gathering in his chest. Hazel found him there at midnight, having woken up thirsty, and asked, her voice barely above a whisper, if the mean things people were saying online were true, because 2 girls at school had shown her the article on a cracked phone screen during lunch and laughed while she read it. The crack in Jonah's voice when he told her no, none of it was true, broke something in him he hadn't expected, and he held her on the couch until she finally fell back asleep against his shoulder. The following Monday, one of the girls from school, a classmate named Delaney, cornered Hazel by the lockers and asked loudly if her brother was really some kind of criminal, loud enough that a small crowd gathered to watch Hazel's face turn red. Hazel didn't cry, though she wanted to, and instead told Delaney flatly that her brother had given up money for a stranger who needed it more than he did, and that not everyone would understand that kind of person, which was fine, because Delaney clearly didn't. Hazel came home that afternoon and told Jonah the whole story at the kitchen table, proud of herself in a quiet, steady way that reminded him painfully of their mother, and he hugged her so hard she complained he was wrinkling her jacket. It was a small moment in the middle of an ugly week, but it stayed with him longer than most of the cruel comments online ever did, a reminder of exactly what he was fighting to protect. Margot arrived at his apartment before sunrise, having driven herself for the first time in years, snow still clinging to her boots when he opened the door. She told him she knew exactly who had planted the story, that Desmond had all but confirmed it with the smug satisfaction on his face at the office that morning, and she promised she would fix it, though neither of them yet knew how. And for a moment, they simply stood in the doorway, holding onto each other in the cold. The trouble was that fixing it meant proving a negative, demonstrating that Jonah had never asked anyone for anything, and public opinion rarely waited around for careful proof. Margot's own board grew nervous, worried the scandal would bleed into the company's reputation right as a major shipping contract negotiation was underway, and 2 directors privately suggested she distance herself from Jonah until the story died down on its own. For one terrible night, Margot considered it, sitting alone in her father's old study, surrounded by photographs of a man who had built everything from nothing and never once let anyone shame him into shrinking himself. She thought about how disappointed he would have been to watch her choose comfort over the one person who had asked nothing of her, and by morning she had made her decision, though it cost her sleep she desperately needed. She called an emergency meeting with the board, and to Desmond's visible surprise, announced that she would not be stepping back from anything, that the company's reputation would survive scrutiny built on facts, and if it couldn't survive the truth, it didn't deserve her name on its letterhead either. Desmond argued loudly that appearances mattered more than she understood, and Margot, calmer than she had been in weeks, told him appearances had never once fed anyone in this family. Jonah, meanwhile, had discreetly reached out to the woman quoted anonymously in the original story, tracking her down through an old fare receipt after Walter helped him pull records from the rideshare company's support line. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop, visibly nervous, and told him she had never spoken to any reporter at all, her name simply attached to a fabricated quote by someone she'd never met, and she agreed on the spot to record a statement denying the entire account. Margot spent that week fielding calls from board members and old family friends alike, most of them polite on the surface but carrying the same underlying question, whether she truly trusted a man she had known for a matter of weeks. She found herself repeating the same answer each time, that she had trusted plenty of people she'd known for years who turned out to be strangers wearing familiar faces, and Jonah had never once felt like a stranger, not from that very first ride. She drove to his apartment one evening carrying a folder of printed comments from the article, wanting him to see that she wasn't hiding from any of it, and found him at the kitchen table patiently, helping Hazel practice her multiplication tables as though the entire internet wasn't calling him a predator that same afternoon. Watching him patiently correct Hazel's 7 times table with the same steady calm he'd shown her the night they met, Margot understood with sudden clarity exactly why Desmond had felt so threatened by him. Walter, watching the whole situation unfold with the patient eyes of a man who had served the Sterling family for 3 decades, began asking questions of his own on his own time, remembering odd inconsistencies in expense reports he'd noticed over the years and never had reason to investigate. What he found, buried in years of logistics contracts routed through a shell vendor called Rourke Freight Solutions, made his hands shake as he printed the documents in the empty study late one night. Desmond had been secretly siphoning money from Sterling Logistics for almost 4 years, funneling padded shipping contracts through a company registered under his wife's maiden name, small enough amounts each quarter to avoid drawing attention from auditors focused on larger numbers. Walter brought the printouts to Margot the next morning, his voice unsteady, telling her he should have looked sooner, that he was sorry it took a scandal about her driver to make him finally check. Margot sat with the papers spread across her father's desk for a long time, feeling something shift inside her chest, colder and clearer than grief, closer to resolve. She understood now why Desmond had moved so quickly and so viciously to discredit Jonah the moment she started paying real attention to the company again, because a distracted heiress was easy to manage, and an engaged one was a threat to everything he'd been stealing behind the company's back. She called an all-hands board meeting for that Friday afternoon, telling no one, not even Walter, exactly what she intended to say, only that everyone needed to be present, including Desmond. Jonah offered to come with her, and though she told him he didn't have to, she also admitted, in a smaller voice, that she wanted him there, that facing this felt easier with him standing somewhere in the room where she could see him. The boardroom on Friday was full, snow falling steadily past the tall windows behind the long table, casting the whole room in a pale silvery light that felt almost ceremonial. Desmond arrived last, as he often did, settling into his chair with the same confident ease he always carried, glancing once toward the back of the room where Jonah stood near the door, arms crossed, and smirking just slightly, as though the outcome of the meeting had already been decided in his favor. Margot stood at the head of the table and thanked everyone for coming on short notice, then explained calmly that she had spent the last several days reviewing every claim made against Jonah Merritt and found each one fabricated, sourced from a woman who had never spoken to any journalist and never met him beyond a single ordinary ride. The room went quiet, several directors glancing uneasily toward Desmond, whose smirk had begun to falter around the edges. She then placed Walter's printouts on the table, sliding copies to each director, and explained in a steady, unwavering voice exactly what those documents showed. For years of siphon contracts, a shell company under a familiar last name, numbers that added up to nearly $600,000 diverted from the company her father had spent his whole life building from a single delivery truck and a rented warehouse. Desmond's face drained of color as the room absorbed what they were looking at, and he tried to laugh it off at first, calling it an accounting misunderstanding that any auditor could clear up in an afternoon. Margot slid one final page across the table, a signature page from the shell company's registration, and asked him calmly to explain, if he could, why his own wife's maiden name appeared as the listed owner of a vendor his division had approved 17 separate times. He tried to speak again, insisting there had to be some mistake, that the accounts could be explained, but his voice cracked in a way that betrayed him before his words even finished forming. One of the older directors, a woman named Marjorie Calder who had worked alongside Harold Sterling for 20 years, simply asked him to explain the shell company's registered owner if he could do it honestly, and he couldn't, and everyone in the room watched him fail to. Desmond's eyes swept the table looking for even one ally, and found none, not from the directors who had known his stepfather for decades, not from the assistants who had long noticed his temper, not from anyone who had ever actually liked him rather than simply tolerated him. He turned finally toward Margot, his voice dropping low and bitter, and told her she would regret humiliating him in front of the entire board over a driver who would leave her the second the money got complicated. Margot met his eyes without flinching and told him that the only person in that room who had ever made her feel small over money was him, and that Jonah had never once asked her for a single dollar, which was more than she could say for the man who had just been caught stealing 600,000 of them. The room stayed silent as security stepped forward, and Desmond finally stood, straightening his jacket with the last scrap of composure he had left. Security escorted Desmond from the building 20 minutes later, his access badge deactivated before he even reached the elevator, his protests trailing behind him down the hallway until the doors closed and cut them off completely. Margot didn't watch him go, choosing instead to look toward the back of the room, where Jonah stood with an expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet pride, snow still falling silently outside the windows behind him. The story broke publicly within days, this time with the full truth attached, Desmond's embezzlement dominating headlines that had briefly tried to paint Jonah as the villain of Margot Sterling's life. His rideshare account reactivated within hours, riders leaving apologetic messages, and the same blog that had published the original story ran a lengthy correction alongside an interview with Margot herself defending him without hesitation, calling him the most honest person she had met in that entire building. For a while, things felt like they were finally settling into something good. Jonah's driving picking back up, Hazel's art teacher praising a new confidence in her work, Margot slowly stepping into her father's role at the company with real support behind her instead of quiet resistance. Margot even rode along with Jonah on a slow Tuesday afternoon just to see what his days actually looked like, laughing in disbelief at how many strangers recognized him now and thanked him through the window at stoplights. But the scandal had left its own kind of frost behind, one that had nothing to do with Desmond and everything to do with fear neither of them wanted to say out loud. Margot began pulling back in small ways Jonah almost didn't notice at first, canceling a dinner here, answering texts a little slower there, until one snowy evening in her father's study, she finally admitted what had been sitting heavy in her chest since the board meeting. She told him she was terrified that being with him would always mean dragging him through this world's cruelty, that every time she cared about someone, it seemed to cost them something, and she wasn't sure she could forgive herself if it happened again. Jonah listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when she finished, he told her, steady and unhurried, that he hadn't survived his parents' deaths and 5 years of raising Hazel alone by running from hard things, and he wasn't about to start now over a rich man's lies that had already been exposed. He told her he wasn't afraid of her world, only of losing something that had made his life feel less lonely than it had been since the highway accident took everything else from him. Margot looked at him for a long moment, snow gathering silently on the windowsill behind her, and admitted that she'd spent so many years believing her father's money made her impossible to truly know that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen for something other than the Sterling name. Jonah reached for her hand across the desk and told her plainly that he had never once seen the name, only her, from the very first night in the back of his cab. She asked him, her voice low, if he was certain, if he understood that being with her meant board meetings and photographers and stepbrothers who might not always lose so cleanly, that it meant a life far messier than the one he'd built alone with Hazel in their small apartment. Jonah thought about it honestly instead of answering too quickly, the way he thought about most things that mattered, and told her that he'd rather have a messy life with her in it than a quiet one without her. and that Hazel had already decided months ago that the Snow Lady was staying whether either adult agreed to it or not. She hesitated one more moment, the kind of hesitation that comes right before someone finally lets themselves believe good things are allowed to last, her fingers tightening slightly around his before she let herself relax completely. Then she stepped around the desk and let him pull her into an embrace that felt like the exhale she'd been holding since the night her father died. The two of them standing together while snow kept falling outside the window behind them, thick and slow and endless, the kind of snowfall that made the whole city feel like it was being given a fresh start. 3 months later, Sterling Logistics announced record community investment under Margot's full leadership, funding scholarships for kids in the neighborhoods her father had grown up poor in, and a modest fund specifically supporting rideshare and delivery drivers facing wrongful platform bans, something Jonah had once casually suggested to her without expecting it to actually happen. Hazel got her own printed credit line for the mural she painted in the new community wing lobby, a wide winter scene full of cardinals and bare branches and one small yellow cab tucked in the corner. Walter cried a little at the unveiling, though he blamed it on the cold when anyone asked, and told Jonah afterward that Harold Sterling would have liked him, that the old man always said you could tell everything about a person by what they did when nobody important was watching. Yolanda from the front desk framed a photo from that day and kept it at her station, telling every new hire the story of the driver who refused $14. That same December, on a night thick with fresh snow, Jonah invited Margot and Walter both to a small dinner in his apartment. Nothing fancy, just Hazel's favorite pasta and mismatched chairs pulled in from the neighbors. Margot brought a pie from the diner by the river, insisting she'd finally learned to order it right. And Walter told stories about Harold Sterling as a young man that made Margot laugh until she had to wipe her eyes, a sound that filled the small apartment in a way it hadn't in years. Hazel fell asleep on the couch before dessert, worn out from laughing, and Jonah carried her to bed while Margot and Walter cleared the table together like they'd been doing it their whole lives. Standing in the kitchen doorway afterward, watching the snow collect on the windowsill outside, Jonah thought that this, more than any mansion or boardroom victory, was what his parents would have wanted for him, a table full of people who actually chose to be there. Jonah still drove sometimes, not because he needed the money anymore, but because he liked the work, liked the strangers who climbed into his back seat carrying stories he'd never otherwise hear, liked remembering exactly how his own story had started with $14 he chose not to take. Walter still called him every Sunday just to check in, insisting he'd earned the right to be considered family, snow or no snow. Desmond, for his part, faced federal charges by early spring, and though the trial dragged on longer than anyone at Sterling Logistics wanted to think about, the evidence Walter had uncovered proved impossible to argue away in front of a jury. Margot testified when asked to, calm and precise, refusing to let her voice shake even once, and afterward told Jonah, in a low voice, that some part of her still grieved the stepbrother Desmond might have been if greed hadn't gotten there first. On the first real snowfall of the following winter, Margot climbed into the passenger seat of Jonah's car instead of the back, laughing as she brushed snowflakes from her hair and asked him where he wanted to go, since for once neither of them had anywhere they actually needed to be. Hazel leaned forward from the back seat, already bundled in her coat, and announced that she had opinions about the destination, mostly involving hot chocolate and the diner with the good pie, and both adults laughed at how little say they actually had in the matter. He looked at her for a moment, at the woman who had once cried in his back seat and somehow ended up changing his entire life, and told her it didn't matter where they ended up, as long as they went together, and pulled the car gently out into the falling snow, wipers ticking softly against a windshield already dusted white. If this story reminded you that kindness always finds its way back around, give it a like, subscribe to Wintervale for more, and tell me in one word how this story made you feel.